Hey everyone! Before I dive into this absolutely insane story about how one over-controlling HOA Karen tried to ruin my family's life and ended up destroying her own little empire within just 3 hours, make sure you hit that subscribe button because you are not going to believe the twists and turns in this roller coaster. And trust me, you don't want to miss the kind of wild real-life revenge stories that come out of situations like this. So grab some popcorn, because here we go. It all started when my family moved into what we thought was a peaceful suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where kids ride their bikes on cul-de-sacs, neighbors wave when you pass by, and the loudest sound you hear at night is maybe a sprinkler system turning on. But what we didn't realize was that we had stepped into a minefield carefully laid out by none other than Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the local homeowners association, who strutted around with her clipboard like she was some kind of sheriff, barking orders about lawn lengths, mailbox paint colors, and even what time you could put out your trash cans. And from the moment we arrived, she decided that our refusal to join her beloved HOA was an unforgivable crime, even though by law the HOA in that neighborhood was voluntary, not mandatory, something she absolutely hated, because she thrived on control, on power, on getting her way by intimidation, and she was not going to let one family slip through her fingers without a fight. At first it was small stuff. She would drop by uninvited to remind us that everyone participates in the HOA, as if it was some cult, and when we politely said, thanks, but no thanks, she started escalating, first with passive-aggressive notes in our mailbox about how our lawn didn't meet community standards, even though it was trimmed perfectly fine, then with nasty whispers to neighbors about how we were freeloaders, benefiting from HOA amenities without paying, even though there were no real amenities besides her precious newsletters, and soon she was standing on our driveway one Saturday morning, hands on her hips, demanding we pay her $600 initiation fee, or else, to which my dad calmly told her to leave our property, but that only seemed to flip some switch inside her head, because that's when things went from annoying to downright hostile. Now, Karen had connections, or at least she liked to think she did, and one of her favorite tactics was calling the cops on neighbors for the dumbest reasons, like one time she called them on a teenager for skateboarding near the mailboxes, and another time she called on a dad who had set up a small inflatable pool in his backyard without HOA approval. So when we continued refusing her extortion disguised as HOA dues, she made her boldest move yet. She actually called the police on us, claiming we were refusing to comply with mandatory HOA laws, and disturbing community harmony. And I'll never forget that evening, because we were sitting down to dinner when 2 officers knocked on our door, looking slightly annoyed but obligated to follow up, and after a few minutes of explaining that this was a voluntary HOA, that we had all the legal paperwork proving our right not to join, and that Karen had wasted police time, the cops actually apologized to us and left, clearly used to her nonsense, but apparently that humiliation was too much for Karen to handle, because the very next morning she rallied her little HOA board, a group of equally nosy busybodies who were basically her minions, and decided to teach us a lesson. And here's where the universe decided to intervene in the most spectacular way possible, because little did Karen know, one of her board members had been skimming money from the HOA funds, and another had been illegally issuing fines to neighbors and pocketing the cash, and someone, still don't know who, had tipped off the authorities about possible fraud inside the HOA. So while Karen was sitting in her little board meeting, probably ranting about how we were the downfall of society for not paying her dues, 3 hours after she had the cops waste their time on us, the tables turned when actual investigators rolled up with warrants, raiding the HOA office, which was basically a converted garage, seizing documents, and questioning everyone on the board, including Karen herself, who was screaming about how this was all a misunderstanding and that she was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. But it was too late, because the evidence spoke for itself. And watching from our porch as squad cars lined up outside her house felt like the most poetic justice imaginable. And that should have been the end. But the fallout was even juicier, because neighbors who had been silently fed up with her tyranny started coming forward with their own horror stories. False fines, harassment, threats of foreclosure that weren't even legally enforceable. And suddenly the entire facade of Karen's control crumbled overnight. Lawsuits piled up against her and the board. The HOA was disbanded, and Karen herself was slapped with charges for misuse of funds and obstruction, which meant the woman who once strutted around acting like she owned us all was now reduced to a disgraced figure hiding behind drawn blinds, while my family, the so-called rebels who refused to bend, were suddenly seen as the ones who had sparked the beginning of her downfall. Neighbors thanking us for standing our ground, some even admitting they'd been too scared to say no to her before. But here's the best twist. Months later, when everything had settled, one of the investigators stopped by our house to thank us for our patience that night the cops first showed up, and he told us, off the record, that Karen's phone call about us had actually helped them build a stronger case, because it highlighted her abuse of authority and gave them the final push to dig deeper. So in a way, by trying to ruin us, she ended up sealing her own fate, and I still laugh thinking about how she must replay that decision in her head every single day, regretting the moment she picked up the phone to dial 911 over something so petty. So remember, folks, sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be controlled, because bullies like Karen always dig their own graves if you give them enough time, and in our case, it only took 3 hours for karma to come knocking with flashing lights and a search warrant. And if you enjoyed this insane tale of HOA madness, make sure you subscribe because I've got plenty more stories where this came from. And trust me, you don't want to miss the next one.